Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome you to the second webinar in our Sphere Compliance series, focusing on 23 NYC RR 500, otherwise known as the New York Cybersecurity Requirements. Today, we will be going over implementing policies and reducing risk as it relates to the compliance game. My name is George Nikonarov, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon. During today's presentation, we urge you to send us your questions on the topic, as they'll be answered sequentially at the end. Instructions are outlined on this slide, as you can see, and there's a similar looking questions tab in the right-hand corner. Again, we'll be answering your questions in the sequence they have been received. We have a very factual presentation for you today, but before we jump into the topic, first up, I would like to introduce Brittany Pimpinella, Sales Associate for Sphere Technology Solutions. Brittany.
George, thank you. My name is Brittany Pimpinella, and I'm a Sales Associate here at Sphere Technology Solutions. I would like to share with you a brief introduction to Sphere so that you will know who we are, what we do, and how we help our clients in achieving their security and compliance goals. Sphere Technology Solutions is a cybersecurity company. We focus on protecting your data, with a heavy emphasis on your most sensitive data. We find it, secure it, and provide all the mechanisms to manage data security long-term. We work with the largest and most complex firms in the world, which has allowed us to grow over 600% over the last 4 years. We solve our clients' complex cybersecurity challenges by providing the analytics that measure risk, executing on the remediation programs to reduce risk, and deploying automation solutions to effectively manage risk. Let's focus on the three inner circles: data, systems, and access. These circles represent a typical information technology landscape when viewed from a high level. First is the data, the information all companies create and use each day in the operation of their business. Systems, this is where the data lives. Systems can be on-premise, off-premise, or in the cloud. The most common scenario is a blend of all three. Next is access. Data and systems must be accessed by employees in order for them to perform their jobs. This access must consider the needs of a wide range of workers, including the frontline employee, the middle manager, all the way up to the C-suite. Additionally, there are access requirements for non-employees, such as business partners, customers, and vendors. Access to data must consider the needs of each of these constituents. From a purely operational perspective, the task of managing these core components is quite complicated. However, one must consider the impact of security. What are the threats an organization must defend against? Are these threats internal, external, or both? Compliance. What are the regulations that apply to your industry, and how do you abide by these regulations? Governance. What is the target operating model for data, systems, and access? How does a target operating model enforce security, prove compliance, and how is this model maintained? Sphere identifies security and compliance concerns, remediates the risks, and creates the governance model to prevent a return of these challenges. First, we collect and analyze the metadata from platforms, tools, and repositories in the target environment. This analysis enables Sphere to produce the key risk indicators which are necessary for establishing and maintaining the target operating model for your organization. Key risk indicators are created by applying business intelligence to the collected metadata. There are three layers to business intelligence: industry best practices, Sphere's best practices, and our customers' business intelligence. The key risk indicators can then be leveraged in a multitude of ways. They can deliver an assessment which provides visibility into the extent of issues as a one-time snapshot into the health of your organization. The key risk indicators can be used to create a risk prioritized plan to remediate the identified risks and enhance the policies and procedures used to manage the environment. During remediation, the key risk indicators become very exciting, as the metrics that measure security and compliance will improve during the execution of the remediation plan. At the automation stage, the governance model is now in place. so that an organization can be managed by the key risk indicators. This is where risk mitigation becomes a business as usual activity. Here are several examples of the work we have done in 6 different organizations. You'll notice that there are common themes among these customer success stories. Sphere delivering visibility to uncover and measure risk. Sphere understanding the identities, ownership, and use cases for data, systems, and access. And Sphere leveraging these metrics to make a positive impact for our clients. I'd like to draw your attention to a specific example where we improved regulatory compliance for our customers. Sphere developed and deployed the controls necessary to enforce information barriers that are required by outside regulators. Sphere established alerts to identify instances when attempts were made to pierce these barriers. This customer is no longer subject to audit failures, regulatory actions, and financial penalties. This relates to what Michael will be talking about today. You will learn the mechanics behind an effective cybersecurity policy and what is needed to comply. I would like to now introduce our featured speaker, Michael Mihalik. Michael is the Chief Information Security Officer at Sphere Technology Solutions and is tasked with leading our CISO advisory services. He has over 33 years of risk management experience gained from working with leading property casualty insurance companies. Prior to joining Sphere Technology Solutions, Michael was the Chief Information Security Officer for ProSite Specialty Insurance and the Chief Privacy Officer for Tower Insurance Company of New York. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brittany. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the New York Department of Financial Services webinar on implementing policies and protecting from risk. A little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is provided for informational purposes only. It is no way meant to be legal advice, and you should consult your attorney for advice regarding your individual situation. If you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. He was a Chinese general, military strategist, and a philosopher. He also said, if you also know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory, you also suffer defeat. And if you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. This is what cybersecurity and risk management is all about. It's about knowing yourself and knowing your enemy or your threats. So this is the topics we'll be covering today. Your compliance timeline refresher, the CISO, building a cybersecurity program, determining your risk, your assets, your vulnerabilities, understanding the threat landscape, and analyzing risk. So compliance refresher. September 1st, 2017 is our first milestone where we are 142 days away from this deadline, or it's 103 work days. By now, you should have hired your CISO, who's busy hiring cybersecurity personnel to work on and manage the core cybersecurity functions. He should be building his cybersecurity program, policies, building an access privilege system, and making sure he has an incident response plan in place. As we talk today, we'll be focusing on the cybersecurity program, the policies, and a risk assessment. Although risk assessment is not in the first milestone, it is something that you need to do. It's the foundation of building a good cybersecurity program. You need to know your strengths, your weaknesses, and know what your threats are. So our CISO, he's a qualified individual doing the assessment. This assessment will eventually lead into the design of the cybersecurity program, which will eventually lead into the management, the overall effectiveness, and eventually the reporting. And in this case, for New York Department of Financial Services, you will need to report to them. The cybersecurity program is about building or identifying your future state. That should be built around a security framework. For example, there are many out there, and we'll cover some of those later, but you need to identify what your future state will look like. And you're going to do that by doing your assessment, identifying control gaps, identifying your security risks, and implementing policies. And the roadmap is going to be based on a prioritized basis. That means you may be hiring new people, introducing new policies and procedures, processes, controls, and technology to get to your future state. And once you're there, you'll be in compliance, you'll have good metrics, you'll be able to monitor your environment, And if you ever have an incident, you'll use that as lessons learned so you can make constant changes to your environment. So these are the cybersecurity frameworks. There's many of them out there. For example, there are others that are not listed. Some of these are free of charge. Some of them you have to pay to implement them or to use their framework. The key here is that you need to make sure you follow a framework that is best suited for your company. They're all different. For example, if you're collecting payment card data, then you should probably go do the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS. If you're not doing that, then one of the other ones might suffice. But again, I reinforce that we want to make sure it's the one that is best suited for your organization. So how do you do a risk assessment? It's about identifying systems, data, value to your assets. It's about understanding your vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities become in culture, people, process, and technology, and understanding your threats. And there can be natural, human, and environmental. And where those three converge, that's your risk. And since we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about cybercrime, and that is usually done by human threats. And they could they are accidental or deliberate, and we'll talk more about that. But it's going to be across, and your threat actors are nation states, organized crime, terrorists, hacktivists, your competitors, and also malicious insiders. How do you do a risk assessment? Well, it's a deep dive into your organization. It's understanding your threats, vulnerabilities, and assets. You're asking a lot of detailed questions. You're gathering lots of information. If a prior risk assessment was done, you're grabbing that. If you're doing vulnerability scanning, you're grabbing that. And all that has to be brought together. And you're interviewing key people. For example, you'll be asking the same questions to different people because what you want to discover or discover is whether or not the actual process is being implemented uniformly across the organization. If it's not, it adds complexity and risk. So making sure we understand the who, the how, the what, the when, the where, and the why is going to help us understand where your vulnerabilities are. This will be across many domains. For example, your facilities or physical domain, application development, configuration and change management, logical access, data governance, and others. Assets, something that has value and it's worth protecting. That is probably the most important thing. And if you don't know what you have, you cannot protect it. So you need to create an inventory. You need to be able to identify what your assets are, where they're located, how you classify them, what the value is, and who is the owner. Having an asset owner is very important. They determine what protections need to be placed around that asset. I'm sure we all have somebody in our organization who does it this way. They fill the void when management does not communicate to them what is the acceptable behavior. The way you overcome this situation is you implement administrative controls. Administrative controls are concerning policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines. You're advising people what is the acceptable behavior. There are other controls too. For example, we've talked about administrative controls. There are technical controls, which are basically controls implemented through technology, and there are physical controls, which are basically around facilities. For example, a fence or an ID card. They're limiting access to certain locations. Within controls can be categorized as directive, a deterrent, a preventative, detective, corrective, or recovery. So, for example, a technical control that's a deterrent would be a warning banner as you log onto your system every day. That banner would tell you what is the acceptable use of company assets or data. It's a reinforcement of what you've been told or read in the policy. Compensating controls are controls that basically exist because previous controls or recommended controls cannot be enforced or technically implemented at the current time. These require lots of supervision and manual effort. So, for example, the CCTV, closed circuit TV, somebody's got to be watching that, and if they're not watching it, the control is not effective. While we're talking about effectiveness, this is a perfect example of control that was designed that was ineffective. There's a security gate, and it limits access to the parking lot. Obviously, the control was not designed correctly because there's a workaround, and people are able to get past this control without actually going through the control. So as we implement our controls, we need to make sure the controls are effective, and we're measuring them for their effectiveness. And the key component here is we also need to document them and communicate them and train people on these controls. Technology. Technology comes in many varieties: software, infrastructure, firmware, devices. As these items are released into our environment, they have flaws or weaknesses in them. Not intentionally put in there, but they do have weaknesses. So the vendors typically put out notifications of how to fix those flaws or those weaknesses. And there's sources out there, for example, Vulnerability Central, Microsoft Security Bulletins, Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures website that identify what you need to do to mitigate a weakness within that infrastructure. My recommendation here is, and this is a very manual process if you do it this way, my recommendation here is you have some kind of tool in place that identifies the weaknesses as soon as they become known so that you can implement or plan for the remediation of that weakness. Of course, you don't know what you don't know. If it's an unknown weakness, there's nothing you can do to remediate that. That's considered a zero-day weakness. So this is our threat landscape. We talked about threat actors, nation states, hacktivists, organized crime, competitors, insiders, both accidental and malicious, terrorists. We've talked about the attack vectors or weaknesses in culture, people, process, and technology. We've talked about our assets and their targets. Again, it's all about monetary value. It's intellectual property. It's personal identifiable information, payment card information, trade secrets, and formulas. Now let's talk about the tools of the trade. This is the attack types. And they use things like ransomware, phishing, malware, application vulnerabilities, password attacks. And there's many, many more of these. We need to keep apprised of these areas so that we can properly defend for them. For example, if we're susceptible for ransomware, we need to make sure we have controls in place to protect ourselves from that threat. And if, as a compensating control, if we can't protect ourselves from that threat, how do we make sure we can recover from that? So having good backups. So now let's get into risk assessments. There are two types of risk assessments. There's the quantitative and there's the qualitative. The quantitative requires you to value every asset, which can be onerous and takes a lot of time to do that. So it is recommended that you use a qualitative risk formula or risk assessment. And that's basically taking the likelihood of a situation and the impact of that situation to come up with a risk score. So for example, likelihood, if a vulnerability is exploitable and can be attacked by an attack or a threat actor, you're going to score that based on a number 1 to 5. And if your impact, and that impact is based on primary and secondary impacts, primary impact would be the actual breach itself, the forensics, things around that. And the secondary would be associated to liabilities or reputational damage, loss of business. Those two would come, and again, that's a score of 1 to 5. Multiplied together should give you a rating somewhere between 1 and 25. This is how you're going to help you prioritize your risks. And we do this through this risk matrix. So by plotting all the information that we know that as we identify these risks and we start plotting it, we'll be able to visually know where we have risk, where we don't have risk, and what we need to do. So the heat map on the far right, I've added another component to it called criticality. Criticality has to deal with the vulnerability of the asset itself, right? The continuation of your business. So for example, if you have a website, and that's the only way your operation does business is through your website, and because of a breach or an incident, the website has to come down until it's remediated. How critical is that to your organization? Can you sustain a loss of 1 day? Can you sustain a loss of 10 days? Can you sustain a loss of 30 days? This criticality needs to be scored so that as you're looking at this matrix, you're making decisions saying, hey, and that's the size of the bubble. my bubble is a 5, I have a big bubble. If my bubble is a 1, it's a small bubble. If you see that that bubble is big, that's something you need to look at because that'll help you prioritize those in the top right quadrant. The risk register. So here we're talking about a cybersecurity risk register, but it really applies to the organization. There should be an organizational risk register because there's other risks within the organization that need to be identified, prioritized, and monitored. The cybersecurity one gets plugged into that. And that basically identifies the risk owners, identifies the method of risk treatment, whether we're going to mitigate, transfer, accept, or avoid. We identified the residual risk. Residual risk is risk that is remains after applying controls. And then we need to be able to have a way to document what we've decided to do with that risk, and we need a way to monitor and track our risks. For example, if we decided to accept a particular risk, if the business changes for any reason or the technology changes for another reason, that risk that was accepted may now be feasible to apply a countermeasure to, so that it is now something that we can resolve or mitigate. But that needs to be reviewed on a periodic basis. So here's an example of a risk register, and I know it's hard to kind of read, but the first line I'm going to use is the loss of credit card numbers. This one, the likelihood was considered almost certain because for whatever reason, the system that they're using had some vulnerabilities in it. And this is an example, so this is not any particular company. And that the impact of this loss of credit card numbers would have been catastrophic. And that's right there under the initial risk assessment. And as a result of that, that got a score of 25, and I put a risk score in red of 5. So I use that as my methodology. So we have a very high risk. It's in the top right quadrant of the risk matrix that we showed you before. And as a result of that, the decision was made that they could not do anything with, and again, a sample, could not do anything with the system, but we are going to apply data encryption as a mitigation strategy to prevent the data from being used. So the vulnerability does, or the likelihood still exists, it's still the same, almost certain, but now the impact would be almost minimal or insignificant because once the data is encrypted, it cannot be used by the hacker unless they're able to break the encryption. And if you're using a good encryption algorithm, you know, the work factor on breaking that is almost, you know, it's significant. So now our residual risk went to a score of 1. So very important that, you know, this is a good way to see what we're doing with this. I'm sure this is something that New York would ask for as time goes on. So in conclusion, you need to know your crown jewels. You need to know your critical systems. You need to know your threats, your weaknesses. Going back to what Sun Tzu said, we need to know ourselves and we need to know our enemy if we want to be successful. You need to do periodic risk assessments. Periodic risk assessments help you identify changes in your organization that can change your risk posture. And we want to automate controls and make sure those controls are effective. That's being more proactive rather than reactive. With that, I turn it over to George to answer questions, and I thank you.
Mike, thank you very much for that very detailed webinar. I appreciate the facts and information that you were sending us. Just as a reminder, please feel free to send us your questions in the questions tab in the box in the right-hand corner. We'll be answering them sequentially. And we do have some questions that are coming in right now, and I'll start going through them. So one of our attendees asked a question centering around the impact of residual risks. Ultimately, how do you reduce it? And that's a pretty detailed, broad question, Mike, right? I mean, so they're asking specifically, how do you reduce the impact of residual risks?
So you can never avoid risk. Companies are in business, they always have risk. So I'm going to use a car accident as an example, right? So to reduce your likelihood of having a car accident, you can stop texting, you don't drink and drive, you go through some kind of driver's training, right? Those are all your controls. To reduce your impact, right, and that's injury or damage to the car itself, you drive a car that's not worth much value, you wear your seatbelt, you wear your airbags, you reduce your speed, you make sure your safety features work. So, when you look at that, you might score yourselves 1 and 1 in each one of those because you've implemented the controls that you needed to do, but that does not eliminate the risk of ever having an auto accident again. There's still a likelihood that an accident happens. It might not happen as frequently, but it will definitely mitigate that.
Okay, again, I'd like to remind the audience to send us your questions in the questions tab. I noticed somebody actually raised their hand, and it's easier to just send the question to us in the question tab. If you hit the arrow in the right-hand corner, you'll see that a questions tab will come up, and you can type in your question or statement as they come in. With that said, next question we're getting is how can you help me see whether or not there are vulnerabilities in my environment? And that's a very interesting detailed question, because the vulnerability assessment is absolutely key in this as the overall risk assessment, correct?
Yes. So vulnerabilities can be anywhere within your system, and you need to get a good tool that helps you assess your vulnerabilities across the organization. Because vulnerabilities can exist in servers, in infrastructure, networking. So unless you have a tool that can help you understand where your vulnerabilities lie, and that you are testing, because even though you don't want to rely just on vulnerability scans, you want to also rely on penetration testing. And that's the next topic of our seminar, is making sure that, that you have these things in place so you can identify where your weaknesses are. Because, again, technology has flaws. Technology has weaknesses. We need a tool to help us identify that.
Okay, a couple more questions are coming in, and please keep them coming to the questions tab in the dialog box in the right-hand corner. So we got a question from one of the attendees centering around reporting requirements, which I believe you might have covered in certain aspects in the initial webinar we did. So the question centers around whether the reporting requirements, or let me rephrase that, are there reporting requirements to the NYS superintendent regarding your cybersecurity program? And then the question is when, what, and how. Okay. So Mike, can you answer that, please?
Sure. So if you're not exempt, then you have a reporting requirement. The first reporting requirement you have to do is internally to your board, which is at the 1-year mark. But then you have to report to the superintendent any events or incidents that are likely to impact the organization, materially impact the organization. And I'm sure during their market conduct surveys, if you're supervised by the Department of Financial Services, they will be asking for detailed information about your cybersecurity program during that market conduct study.
Okay. Another question coming in, doesn't matter if the size of the company, we're talking about exemptions in a previous webinar, but again, it's being asked. Can smaller companies less than 50 to 100 people afford a risk assessment? And what should be the biggest concern getting started with DFS? Again, I'd like to remind everybody to send their questions through the questions tab in the dialog box in the right-hand corner. I noticed that some people, again, are raising their hand. Please go ahead and do that. But anyway, Mike, back to you.
So, yeah, you've got to weigh your choices here. I think it's important to do a risk assessment. They're not that expensive to do, especially in smaller organizations, because you don't have as much technology. You don't have a bigger footprint. So it should be relatively inexpensive. Remember, you're balancing that with potential loss. So understanding where you are within your organization, knowing yourself, knowing your weaknesses, is going to help you put a plan together. And again, as you go through the process, you might find out that you're in good shape. You don't have to invest that much. So it's definitely worth the value of doing that risk assessment so that you know exactly where you stand.
Okay, and looks like we got one final question coming in. And that question centers around the frameworks. So basically, talking about the frameworks that you had up earlier. Is there a specific cybersecurity framework that you would recommend following? Is there something that would comply with DFS? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So all cybersecurity frameworks have the same intent. The same intent is to protect your systems, protect your data. So they're all coming at it a little different way. You've got to pick a framework, and I'm going to reemphasize this. You've got to pick a framework that works best for your organizations. Some of them are very process-driven. Some of them are very control-driven. So you've got to kind of sit down and look at all of them, the benefits, the negatives of all of them, the costs associated with it. For example, NIST is free. NIST was put together by the federal government to help businesses. And it uses a whole different view of looking at it. But again, they all pretty much do the same thing. You need to put controls in place so that you mitigate your exposure.
Okay, great. With that said, I don't see any additional questions that are coming up. Thank you for attending our webinar today. A final recording will be posted on our website at www.sphereco.com. That's www.sphereco.com. I'd like to thank Mike Mihalik for providing a great presentation today, and like to wish everybody a great afternoon. Bye for now.